Imagine being the self-appointed queen of your neighborhood, wielding power like a clipboard-wielding tyrant, only to make one tiny mistake. Tow a truck for being 4 inches over the line. Sounds petty, right? Well, Dolores Tatum, HOA president of Pine Valley Estates, clearly thought it was a good idea, but here's the twist. She had no clue whose truck she was messing with. What started as a parking violation quickly snowballed into an unforgettable drama that no one saw coming. Turns out, crossing the wrong person can have some pretty explosive consequences. Ever had an encounter with a crazy HOA? Share your experience in the comments and see if it tops this one. Who knows, maybe your story will be even crazier than Dolores. Let me take you to Pine Valley Estates, a middle-class neighborhood in sunny California, where I witnessed the most incredible battle between an HOA tyrant and a deputy sheriff who refused to back down. This story begins on a quiet Monday evening when I watched Deputy Sheriff Marcus Thompson pull into his assigned parking spot after what I later learned was a grueling 12-hour shift. I had been observing this 34-year-old man for 6 months as he kept a low profile and minded his own business like any good neighbor should. I saw his black pickup truck settle into its usual spot with a familiar creak of the parking brake, and I noticed how exhausted he looked as he grabbed his gear and headed straight inside without a second thought. What I realized later was that his truck had come to rest exactly 4 inches away from the painted parking line, a seemingly insignificant detail that would spark the war I'm about to describe to you. Meanwhile, I had been watching Dolores Tatum across the courtyard in her 2-story house, adorned with fake stone lions, and I could tell she was having another financially stressful day. I observed this 39-year-old woman who had built her entire identity around being the HOA president of Pine Valley Estates, and I watched her wield her clipboard like a weapon and her measuring tape like a sword of justice. But what I discovered made Dolores truly dangerous wasn't just her authority. It was her habit of changing rules whenever she needed extra cash. I witnessed her quietly modify parking regulations, then selectively enforce these secret amendments against residents who couldn't afford to fight back. I could see her bleach blonde bob was disheveled from stress, and I noticed unpaid bills sitting on her kitchen counter through her window. I learned that Dolores had discovered her partnership with Eddie Torino's towing company could supplement her income nicely, splitting the $200 towing fees 50-50 whenever she found a violation worth pursuing. I watched Dolores conduct her usual evening patrol that night, and I saw her eyes light up like she'd struck gold when she spotted Marcus's truck. Well, I heard her mutter to herself as she pulled out her measuring tape with precision. I observed her measure those 4 inches, 4 beautiful, profitable inches, over the painted line that I later discovered she had personally repainted just 2 weeks earlier, moving it 6 inches closer to create more violence. I watched Dolores document her discovery from multiple angles, her phone camera clicking away as she built her case. I even saw her take a video, narrating her findings with authority. This is what happens when new residents think they can ignore our community's standards. I heard her announce to her phone screen as she posted the evidence on the neighborhood social media group. I noticed the post received immediate likes from residents too afraid to cross her. I observed Dolores dial Eddie Torino's number without hesitation, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice as she delivered the news. "Eddie, I've got another one for you. Building 4, the black pickup truck, same arrangement as usual." I heard Eddie's gravelly voice confirm through the speaker that he'd have his crew there by 6 in the morning. I watched Dolores end the call and pour herself a celebratory glass of wine, and I could see her calculating her 40% cut. I realized she had no idea that she had just declared war on someone who possessed both the training and the authority to fight back in ways she couldn't imagine. I watched her raise her glass in a toast to her own cleverness while Marcus slept peacefully inside his apartment, completely unaware that his truck would be gone by sunrise. I was there the next morning when everything changed for Marcus, and I watched him get jolted awake by the rumbling sound of a diesel engine and the unmistakable mechanical whine of a tow truck's hydraulic lift. I saw him stumble to his bedroom window, still groggy, and I observed him peer through the blinds in disbelief as his truck disappeared down the street on Eddie's flatbed. I watched him stand there in his boxers and undershirt, coffee mug in hand, trying to process what he was witnessing. I could see a strange feeling invade his consciousness, something different from anything he'd experienced in 10 years of police work. I realized this wasn't just professional frustration, it was something deeper and more personal. It felt like a slap to his dignity, a deliberate insult that challenged everything he believed about fairness and justice. I noticed him spot Dolores standing at her front window, still in her bathrobe, watching the operation with obvious satisfaction. I saw the morning sun catch the lens of her phone as she recorded the truck's removal. I followed Marcus as he dressed quickly and walked outside to examine the empty parking space, and I watched him use the keen eye of someone trained in evidence collection. I saw him study exactly where his truck had been positioned, and I could tell he recognized that while it was indeed slightly over the line, the violation was so minor that any reasonable person would have simply knocked on his door. But I watched his trained eye detect something that made his blood run cold as he knelt down to examine the paint more closely. I saw him discover that the white parking line paint was fresh, barely 2 weeks old, and I watched him realize it didn't align with the faded ghost marks of the original line still visible beneath. I could see the moment when he understood that someone had deliberately moved the boundary to create violations where none had existed before. I witnessed his recognition that this wasn't incompetence or overzealous rule enforcement, but deliberate fraud designed to generate revenue from manufactured infractions. I watched Marcus stand up slowly, his jaw clenched with controlled anger, and I realized he had no idea that he was about to embark on a journey that would expose the dark underbelly of HOA corruption and bring justice to an entire community of intimidated residents. I followed Marcus to Reno Towing by 8 o'clock that morning, and I watched him stand at the gates of this sprawling junkyard disguised as a legitimate business operation located in the industrial district 20 minutes from Pine Valley. I could see the facility looked exactly like what it was, a barely legal enterprise running on the edge of respectability, with dozens of vehicles crammed into every available space. I observed Marcus walk through the lot with his trained eye, cataloging disturbing details. I watched him notice vehicle after vehicle bearing Pine Valley Estates parking stickers, far more than any legitimate operation should handle from a single community. I saw him examine cars that showed no signs of actual violations, while others appeared to have been towed for infractions so minor they bordered on harassment. I realized, along with Marcus, that he was witnessing systematic exploitation designed to extract maximum revenue from vulnerable residents. I watched Eddie Torino emerge from behind bulletproof glass, and I observed this 52-year-old man with grease-stained clothes and the kind of smile that suggested he enjoyed other people's misfortune. I saw Marcus maintain his composure, playing the role of just another frustrated customer while cataloging every detail for future reference. I listened as Eddie said with practiced familiarity, "Let me guess, Pine Valley Estates parking violation. That HOA lady keeps me busier than a one-legged cat in a sandbox. 3 or 4 cars a week from that place alone." I watched the casual admission hit Marcus like a revelation, confirming his suspicion that this was systematic fraud designed to extract money from unsuspecting residents. I heard Eddie continue his unwitting confession with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable, describing how Dolores had become his most profitable client. I observed Marcus count out $200 in cash while Eddie provided even more incriminating details. I heard Eddie say, "Been working with Dolores for about 8 months now. She's got a good eye for violations, and I've got the equipment to handle them. Win-win situation, you know what I mean." I watched Marcus nod politely while his internal alarm bells rang. I could see him recognize this criminal enterprise from his 10 years as a deputy sheriff, understanding that this operation bore all the hallmarks of organized fraud designed to prey on vulnerable communities. I witnessed the moment when the revelation that Dolores had been systematically targeting residents transformed his personal grievance into something much larger and more serious. I saw Eddie hand over the keys with a satisfied grunt, completely unaware that he had just provided detailed evidence of criminal activities to a law enforcement officer. I followed Marcus as he walked back to his truck, and I watched him encounter something that made his professional instincts scream with outrage. I saw him notice sitting in the passenger seat of a Honda Civic with Pine Valley stickers was a child's car seat, its safety straps still adjusted for a toddler who was probably wondering where mommy's car had gone. I read over his shoulder as he examined the violation notice that cited improper visitor parking duration, but I saw the timestamp showed the car had been towed just 3 minutes after the posted time limit expired. I realized, along with Marcus, that this wasn't law enforcement, it was predatory behavior, targeting working parents who might be 60 seconds late returning to their vehicles. I watched the sight of that empty car seat crystallize his determination to stop this criminal enterprise. I was there when Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, and I read along as he saw, "Are you the new guy Dolores targeted? If you want to know the truth about what's been happening here, meet me at my place in 10 minutes. Apartment 12B, Marjorie Holt." I could see the message suggested that other residents had noticed patterns in Dolores's behavior and were ready to share information. I watched Marcus recognize that the best investigations often began with concerned citizens who had been watching and waiting for someone with authority to take action. I followed him as he drove back to Pine Valley, feeling the familiar surge of purpose that came with the beginning of an important case. I accompanied Marcus when he met Marjorie Holt, and I discovered she was a 67-year-old retired teacher with silver hair, keen eyes, and organizational skills that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. I saw her immaculate small apartment, with a large manila folder sitting prominently on her dining room table. I noticed what struck Marcus most was the raw emotion in her eyes, a mixture of grief and determination that spoke to deep personal pain, transformed into righteous anger. I heard her explain with a voice trembling, not with fear but with barely controlled fury. I've been documenting Dolores's violations for 8 months, ever since she showed her true character at my husband's funeral. I watched Marjorie struggle to control her tears as she recounted the story that had changed her from a quiet widow into a determined fighter for justice. I heard her whisper with her teacher's voice carrying authority, "She's not just an aggressive person, she's someone without a shred of human compassion." I examined the evidence folder that revealed photographs, receipts, and handwritten notes, chronicling systematic abuse designed to generate revenue rather than maintain community standards. I saw documentation showing 23 different residents targeted for towing, with total fees exceeding $3,600 extracted through fake or exaggerated violations. I reviewed each incident carefully, documented with dates, times, and photographic evidence. I discovered that beyond financial crimes, Marjorie's records revealed psychological warfare designed to break the spirits of residents who dared question Dolores's authority. I learned that single mothers were targeted with particular cruelty. Elderly residents faced harassment over violations they couldn't physically prevent, and newcomers faced immediate intimidation. I watched Marcus quietly reach into his wallet to pull out his badge as he said, "Mrs. Holt, I'm Deputy Sheriff Marcus Thompson, and I can promise you that this investigation starts today." I saw Marjorie's eyes widen as hope replaced resignation, her face crumpling with relief as she realized justice might finally be possible. I heard Marcus continue with quiet authority, "This isn't just about my truck anymore. Dolores Tatum has been running a criminal enterprise, and it's time for her to face the consequences of her actions." I witnessed Marjorie's transformation from victim to ally, knowing that together they could build a case that would bring justice to an entire community. I observed the whispers begin circulating through Pine Valley estates like wildfire within hours of Marcus retrieving his truck, carrying news that someone had finally stood up to question Dolores's authority. I watched the neighborhood grapevine crackle with electric tension, suggesting change might actually be possible after months of intimidation and fear. I saw Dolores feel the shift immediately, her paranoid instincts honed by years of maintaining control through manipulation and threats. I noticed how conversations stopped when she approached, how residents avoided eye contact during her routine patrols, and how the usual fearful deference had been replaced by something dangerously close to defiance. I witnessed her stand before her bathroom mirror that evening, staring at her reflection with growing panic about losing everything that defined her existence. The power, the control, the ability to make other people afraid of her arbitrary decisions. I watched her paranoia kick into overdrive as she convinced herself that Marcus Thompson represented an existential threat to everything she had built. I observed how in her twisted logic, eliminating that threat justified any level of escalation, regardless of legal or moral boundaries. I saw that Dolores had never accepted defeat gracefully, and I witnessed how the prospect of losing control filled her with rage that bordered on psychotic. I watched her pace her living room like a caged animal, her mind racing through increasingly violent scenarios that would restore her authority and teach the community that challenging her would result in consequences far worse than simple parking violations. I witnessed the harassment campaign begin Wednesday morning when Dolores taped a violation notice to Marcus's door, citing him for excessive lawn height, despite his grass being clearly within acceptable limits. I realized this was the opening move in psychological warfare designed to break his spirit through constant harassment and financial pressure. I saw the $300 fine was completely fabricated, representing the opening salvo in a sustained assault designed to drive him from the community. I watched Thursday bring another notice claiming his doormat violated color restrictions with a $150 penalty, followed by Friday's citation for unauthorized window decorations costing $500. I observed each violation notice become more ridiculous than the last, representing Dolores's descent into petty tyranny that revealed her complete disconnection from reality. I saw the harassment escalate beyond paperwork when Dolores decided that psychological intimidation required more direct action. I watched her late Wednesday night, standing outside her house staring at Marcus's apartment with the calculating expression of someone planning an assault. I could see she wanted more than simple revenge. She wanted to reassert her dominance and remind everyone in Pine Valley that crossing Dolores Tatum resulted in consequences that went far beyond financial penalties. I observed how the darkness provided cover for her escalating behavior, ensuring minimal witnesses if she decided to take aggressive action. I witnessed the midnight harassment begin when Dolores crept across the courtyard like a predator stalking prey, her movements deliberate and calculated to maximize psychological impact. I watched her begin pounding on Marcus's door at exactly 11:30 with aggressive persistence. Having completely abandoned any pretense of reasonable behavior, I saw her flashlight beam sweep across his windows in deliberate patterns designed to wake him, while she called out accusations about noise violations that existed only in her imagination. I heard her shout through the door, "I know you're in there, Thompson. You think you can disrespect this community and get away with it? I'm the president of this HOA, and I'll make your life miserable until you pack up and leave." I could see her rage was evident in every word, complete abandonment of rational thought replacing whatever leadership she might have once possessed. I observed Marcus watch through his peephole, recording every word on his phone while marveling at how completely she had abandoned any pretense of professional conduct or basic sanity. I saw him witness Dolores screaming threats at his door, providing evidence of behavior that went far beyond simple HOA disputes into territory that any reasonable person would recognize as criminal harassment. I watched him see the rage in her eyes, the way her entire body shook with fury, and the complete lack of rational thought that had replaced whatever leadership ability she might have once possessed. I realized along with Marcus that this wasn't just an aggressive HOA president enforcing rules. This was someone who had crossed the line into genuinely dangerous behavior. I witnessed the community response to Dolores' escalating behavior that revealed the depth of fear she had instilled in Pine Valley residents. I saw most neighbors watch the midnight harassment from behind their curtains, too terrified of becoming her next target to offer assistance or report her behavior to authorities. I observed how they had learned through bitter experience that crossing Dolores Tatum resulted in increased scrutiny, fabricated violations, and financial penalties that could quickly spiral out of control for families already struggling with expenses. But I noticed something had changed in Pine Valley's atmosphere. A subtle shift suggesting residents were beginning to recognize their collective power and the possibility that they didn't have to endure this abuse forever. I watched Marcus begin to understand that his personal conflict was just the tip of an iceberg that had been sinking the community's morale for months, but also that his presence might provide the catalyst needed to transform individual grievances into collective action against a tyrant who had ruled through fear for far too long. I followed Marcus as he began conducting surveillance on Eddie's towing operation by Saturday morning. Watching him use systematic criminal investigation techniques, I observed his surveillance reveal something more disturbing than initially suspected as he documented patterns of activity across multiple locations. I saw him discover Eddie's business showed regular visits from at least 4 different HOA presidents, representing communities across the county, suggesting a network of corruption generating substantial revenue through systematic exploitation. I watched the realization dawn that Pine Valley was just one piece of a larger criminal puzzle, transforming his personal vendetta into a professional obligation requiring careful evidence collection that would satisfy prosecution standards. The crucial breakthrough came when Marjorie contacted Marcus with news that would change everything about their investigation. I observed her spend the weekend examining HOA financial records, using her friendship with Nancy, the community's elderly bookkeeper, to gain access to documents revealing the true scope of Dolores' criminal enterprise. I heard Marjorie say during their secret meeting at a coffee shop, her voice trembling with excitement and indignation, "Marcus, you need to see this. Nancy finally decided to trust me with evidence that proves Dolores has been stealing from the community in ways we never imagined." I saw the evidence was clear and compelling: falsified maintenance expenses and inflated vendor payments showing Dolores had been embezzling community funds in addition to her towing kickback scheme. I examined the financial documentation that revealed payments to fictitious companies for services never performed, landscaping work billed but never completed, and maintenance contracts existing only on paper while residents complained about unrepaired amenities. I learned the total suspected embezzlement exceeded $15,000 over Dolores' presidency. money that should have been used for community improvements, but had instead disappeared into her personal accounts. I watched Marcus realize the towing scheme was just one component of a larger financial fraud pattern that could result in felony charges if properly documented. I heard Marjorie say with absolute certainty, "This is the evidence we need." I listened as Marcus explained, "We need more witnesses, people willing to come forward and testify about their experiences with Dolores's harassment and illegal fee collection." I saw Marjorie nod grimly, explaining that fear had kept most residents silent despite growing resentment over Dolores's increasingly aggressive tactics. I observed her describe how she had been quietly reaching out to other residents, using her reputation as a trusted community member to create safe spaces where people could share their stories without fear of retaliation. I heard her suggest maybe if they knew someone with authority was finally taking this seriously, they might find the courage to speak up. I saw the response had been overwhelming, with residents who had suffered in silence finally beginning to believe change might be possible. I realized Marcus had not been alone in this fight, and I watched neighborhood people begin to recognize they too had the right to speak up. I observed how evidence of Dolores's crimes wasn't just contained in official documents. It was written in the lived experiences of dozens of families systematically victimized by someone who had turned community service into personal profit. I witnessed the first breakthrough come Monday evening when 3 additional residents agreed to meet with Marcus after Marjorie vouched for his credibility. I listened as Janet Wilson, a working mother of 2, brought receipts showing she had been forced to pay towing fees twice in 3 months for violations she insisted were completely fabricated. I heard Robert Chen, an elderly gentleman on a fixed income, describe how Dolores had threatened to place a lien on his property over trumped-up landscaping violations that would have cost him nearly $1,000. I listened to Maria Santos share the most disturbing story. Dolores had targeted her teenage son's car repeatedly, claiming various violations that always seemed to occur when the family was struggling financially and least able to afford recovery fees. I watched by Tuesday as word of Marcus's investigation began spreading through the community's informal networks, carried by residents finally beginning to believe change might be possible after months of feeling helpless against Dolores's systematic intimidation. I observed the underground resistance take the form of private conversations, shared documentation, and careful coordination among neighbors who had previously been too isolated and afraid to recognize the strength they could find in unity. I saw Marcus establish a secure communication system using personal phone numbers and private messaging, allowing residents to share information without risking discovery by Dolores. I watched the evidence file grow daily as more residents came forward with stories of harassment, financial exploitation, and intimidation tactics that painted a comprehensive picture of corruption going far beyond simple HOA overzealousness. I observed Marcus begin preparing formal police reports that would document the criminal enterprise in language prosecutors could understand and juries could follow, knowing that success would depend on presenting evidence in a clear, compelling narrative. I saw him work late into the night organizing testimonies and financial records, and I realized along with Marcus that what had begun as a personal grievance over a parking violation had evolved into something much larger. A chance to protect entire communities from predatory behavior and restore faith that justice was possible, even when victims felt powerless against systematic abuse of authority. I witnessed the breaking point arrive Wednesday morning when Dolores discovered the underground resistance through Janet Wilson's teenage daughter, who accidentally mentioned her mother's conversations with that nice police officer. I saw the casual comment hit Dolores like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about organized opposition and revealing that Marcus Thompson possessed resources she had seriously underestimated. I watched within minutes as Dolores paced her living room like a caged animal, realizing she had been treating a law enforcement officer like just another troublesome resident. I observed, rather than recognizing the seriousness of her situation, Dolores decided to escalate the conflict. I watched her stand on the small stage in the community center that she had commandeered for her purposes, pointing an accusing finger at the crowd of residents who had gathered to hear her latest pronouncements. I heard her declare, "If any of you dare to stand up against me, I will make you the next target," her voice echoing with megalomaniacal authority that revealed how completely power had corrupted her judgment. I could see the open threat was clear and unambiguous, designed to intimidate residents into abandoning their growing resistance movement through fear of personal retaliation. I realized her words carried the weight of 3 years of systematic harassment and financial exploitation, reminding everyone present of the very real consequences that had befallen others who had dared to challenge her authority. I observed the response from residents was immediate and unprecedented in the 3-year history of Dolores's presidency. I watched, rather than retreating into fearful compliance as they had done so many times before, the community began to recognize that their individual powerlessness could be transformed into collective strength if they were willing to stand together against their common oppressor. I saw residents begin gathering in small groups throughout the neighborhood, sharing their violation notices and expressing outrage that escalated with each news story of harassment and financial threats. I watched Marjorie emerge as a natural leader, using her teaching experience to organize information and coordinate communication among neighbors who were finally ready to stand together against systematic abuse. I observed the conversation had shifted from quiet complaints about unfair treatment to open discussion of criminal behavior that required law enforcement intervention. I saw by Thursday afternoon Marjorie called for an emergency community meeting that evening. I learned the meeting would take place in the community center that had been closed for months due to budget constraints residents now suspected were related to Dolores's embezzlement. I watched words spread through phone calls and text messages, carrying a sense of urgency that hadn't existed in Pine Valley for years. I witnessed the meeting that evening create an atmosphere unlike anything Pine Valley Estates had experienced during Dolores's presidency. I counted 47 residents attending, representing nearly every family in the community, and creating an atmosphere of nervous energy that suggested years of suppressed frustration were finally finding expression. I heard the community center buzz with conversations that grew louder and more confident as residents realized they were not alone in their experiences with harassment and financial exploitation. I watched when Marcus arrived, wearing his official uniform and badge. The collective gasp marked a moment of transformation that would change Pine Valley forever. I saw the entire hall fall silent when Marcus stepped forward with pride in his full uniform, his presence transforming what might have been dismissed as a neighborhood complaint session into something with the weight and authority of law enforcement behind it. I heard Marcus announce, "Today, I'm not here as a neighbor. I'm here as a police officer, and we will not tolerate this injustice any longer." His voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had dedicated his career to protecting people from exactly the kind of abuse they had all endured. I watched the words seem to unlock something in the community that had been suppressed for months, as resident after resident stood to share testimonies that painted a devastating picture of systematic harassment, financial exploitation, and intimidation tactics that had created an atmosphere of fear throughout their neighborhood. I listened to the testimonies that were powerful and emotional, each story adding to the collective understanding of how extensively Dolores had abused her authority to terrorize vulnerable residents for personal financial gain. I saw the meeting get interrupted by Dolores herself, who burst through the doors like an avenging angel of bureaucratic fury, wielding her clipboard and demanding to know the authority under which residents were conducting unauthorized gatherings in community facilities. I witnessed her arrival create a moment of electric tension, as the woman who had terrorized the neighborhood for years found herself facing a room full of people who were no longer willing to be intimidated by her threats and manipulation. I heard her scream, "This is an illegal assembly. I'll have every one of you fined for violating community regulations," her voice echoing off the walls as residents stared at her with a mixture of fear and newfound defiance. I watched when Marcus stepped forward in his official capacity and informed her that she was now the subject of a criminal investigation for fraud and embezzlement. The balance of power in Pine Valley Estates shifted forever. I witnessed for the first time in 3 years Dolores Tatum found herself facing consequences for her actions, and I saw the look of shock and fear in her eyes that told everyone present her reign of terror was finally coming to an end. I accompanied Marcus as he arrived at the sheriff's station early Friday morning, carrying boxes of evidence that represented months of careful documentation by residents who had finally found the courage to stand up against systematic abuse of authority. I listened as Captain Rodriguez heard Marcus present the case against Dolores Tatum and Eddie Torino, reviewing photographs, financial records, witness statements, and video evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of criminal enterprise designed to exploit vulnerable residents through fabricated violations and illegal fee collection. I watched the captain's expression grow increasingly serious as he realized the scope of the corruption and the potential liability the department could face if they failed to take appropriate action against crimes that had been occurring under their jurisdiction for months without adequate investigation or intervention. I heard Captain Rodriguez observe, reviewing the evidence of Dolores's embezzlement and towing fraud scheme with careful attention, this is exactly the kind of case that destroys public trust in law enforcement. I saw the captain authorize Marcus to conduct a formal investigation with full departmental resources, including the technical support necessary to analyze financial records and the personnel required to coordinate arrests when sufficient evidence had been gathered. I watched Marcus feel a surge of professional satisfaction as he realized that his personal conflict with Dolores had evolved into something much larger. A chance to protect entire communities from the kind of systematic abuse that had terrorized Pine Valley residents, while demonstrating that law enforcement could still serve as a meaningful check against corruption and abuse of authority. I observed the investigation accelerate rapidly as Marcus worked with forensic accountants to trace Dolores's financial crimes and technical specialists to analyze the communication patterns between Dolores and Eddie that proved their conspiracy to defraud residents through fake violations and manipulated regulations. I saw the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed regular deposits corresponding to towing fees, while phone records documented hundreds of calls between the conspirators on days when vehicles were impounded from Pine Valley. I watched security camera footage from Eddie's towing yard that captured several meetings where Dolores received cash payments, creating visual evidence that would be devastating in court. I saw by Friday afternoon Marcus had assembled a prosecution package that any district attorney would find irresistible, with documentation that told a clear story of systematic criminal behavior. I witnessed meanwhile how Dolores was spiraling into increasingly desperate behavior as she sensed the walls closing in around her criminal enterprise. But I observed her response demonstrated how completely she had lost touch with reality and basic self-preservation instincts. I watched her look at herself in the mirror and saw the fear rising in her own eyes as she realized that all her power was now under threat. I could see she wasn't just afraid of losing money or facing consequences for her crimes. She was afraid of losing everything that defined her existence: the power, the control, the ability to make other people afraid of her arbitrary decisions and manufactured violations. I observed her paranoia had reached levels that bordered on complete psychological breakdown, leading her to make increasingly erratic decisions that only provided additional evidence of her guilt and criminal intent. I watched her begin calling the sheriff's department with false complaints about Marcus, claiming he was harassing residents and abusing his authority, accusations that were immediately disproven by the testimonies of 47 witnesses. I witnessed the final confrontation get precipitated by Dolores's decision to make one last desperate attempt to reassert her authority over Pine Valley estates. But I saw her actions revealed someone who had completely lost the ability to assess risk or consider consequences. I watched Saturday morning as she appeared at Marcus's apartment with a folder full of fabricated evidence, claiming he had violated multiple community regulations, demanding his immediate eviction from the property as someone who posed a threat to neighborhood safety and property values. I heard her voice carry across the courtyard as she screamed accusations and threats, waking residents who gathered to witness what many sensed would be the final chapter in their community's long nightmare. I listened as she shrieked, "I'll have you arrested for impersonating a police officer. You think you can intimidate me? I'll destroy your career and have you thrown in jail," apparently forgetting that Marcus had already identified himself in his official capacity during the community meeting. I could hear the desperation in her voice was evident to everyone present, as was the complete disconnection from reality. I watched Marcus emerge from his apartment in full uniform, his badge and authority clearly visible as he calmly informed Dolores that she was under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit theft. I heard the reading of her rights echo across the courtyard as backup officers arrived to secure the scene and ensure that the arrest proceeded without incident. I saw Dolores look at the police team approaching, her heart filled with chaos as I heard her scream, "I can't lose! I've done everything to maintain this power!" But then, as I watched the police officer tighten the handcuffs around her wrists, I saw all hope gradually crumble. I observed her response was immediate and theatrical. She attempted to run toward her house, apparently hoping to destroy additional evidence. But I saw her escape was hampered by the fake designer heels she insisted on wearing, and the garden gnome that her own poor judgment had placed directly in her escape route. I witnessed the sight of Pine Valley's former tyrant sprawling face-first in the dirt while handcuffs were applied, which became an image that residents would remember for years as the moment when justice finally came to their community. I watched when Dolores was being led away, the people started clapping, and I could see each clap was like a liberation, as if all the months of living under threat had ended. I observed the crowd of neighbors who witnessed Dolores's arrest begin applauding spontaneously, their cheers and laughter creating a celebration that marked the end of months of fear and intimidation that had made their daily lives miserable. I learned Eddie Torino was arrested simultaneously at his towing yard, where officers discovered detailed records of his illegal partnership with multiple HOA presidents throughout the county. I saw the scope of the criminal enterprise was even larger than Marcus had initially suspected, with preliminary estimates suggesting that hundreds of residents had been victimized and tens of thousands of dollars had been stolen through fabricated violations and illegal fee collection. I watched as Dolores was loaded into the patrol car, still screaming about conspiracy and persecution, while the residents of Pine Valley Estates finally understood that their long nightmare was over, and their community could begin the process of healing from months of systematic abuse that had torn apart the social fabric of their neighborhood. I accompanied the Pine Valley residents 3 months later as we packed the courtroom to witness the final chapter of Dolores Tatum's reign of terror and ensure that justice was properly served for the crimes that had devastated our community for nearly 2 years. I observed the federal courthouse provided a setting that emphasized the seriousness of charges that had grown beyond simple HOA harassment to include mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy charges that carried significant prison sentences for both Dolores and Eddie. I watched Marcus sit in the gallery wearing his dress uniform, representing not just the investigating officer but the entire community that had suffered under Dolores's systematic abuse of authority and financial exploitation. I saw the prosecuting attorney had built an airtight case using the evidence that residents had carefully documented over months of harassment, creating a narrative that judges and juries could easily understand and that left no doubt about the guilt of the defendants or the harm they had caused to dozens of innocent families. I observed Dolores appear in court wearing an orange jumpsuit that marked her transformation from community tyrant to convicted criminal, her once carefully maintained appearance now showing the effects of 3 months in county jail awaiting trial. I noticed the bleached blonde hair had grown out to reveal gray roots, and the designer clothes had been replaced with institutional clothing that emphasized how completely her circumstances had changed since the morning she had ordered Marcus's truck towed over a 4-inch parking violation that she had manufactured by moving the painted line. I saw Eddie sit beside her at the defendant's table, having already accepted a plea bargain that required him to testify against his former partner in exchange for a reduced sentence and the permanent revocation of his business license. I could see the contrast between their current circumstances and the confident criminals who had operated their fraud scheme with impunity for months was stark and satisfying to the residents who had suffered under their systematic abuse. I listened to the victim impact statements that provided the most powerful moments of the sentencing hearing, as resident after resident stood to describe how Dolores's crimes had affected their lives and their community in ways that went far beyond simple financial loss. I heard Marjorie speak for the entire neighborhood, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the courtroom as she described the climate of fear that had existed under Dolores's presidency, and the relief that residents felt knowing they could finally live without harassment or arbitrary financial penalties. I watched Sarah Mitchell, the single mother whose car had been towed while she tended to her injured child, break down in tears as she described missing work and struggling to explain to her children why the angry lady had taken their car away for no good reason. I listened to Robert Chen speak about the stress of living on a fixed income while constantly worrying about fabricated violations that could result in financial penalties he couldn't afford to pay, and how that stress had affected his health and his ability to enjoy retirement. I watched Judge Patricia Williams listen intently to each testimony, her expression growing increasingly stern as she came to understand the scope of harm that had been caused by Dolores's criminal enterprise, and the way it had destroyed the sense of community and security that residents had every right to expect in their neighborhood. I heard when the time came for sentencing, her words carried the weight of judicial authority and moral outrage that reflected the community's demand for justice and accountability. I listened as she began. Mrs. Tatum, you violated the trust that residents placed in you as their elected representative, using your position of authority to systematically exploit and intimidate the very people you were supposed to serve. Your crimes went beyond simple theft to include psychological abuse of vulnerable residents who looked to you for community leadership. I heard the sentence that reflected the seriousness of the charges. 2 years in state prison, full restitution of $8,000 to affected residents, and a lifetime ban from serving in any HOA leadership position anywhere in the state. I learned Eddie received 18 months in county jail, plus the permanent revocation of his business license, effectively ending his career in the towing industry, and serving as a warning to other operators who might be tempted to participate in similar schemes that prey on vulnerable communities. I saw the judge order the immediate release of all vehicles that had been illegally impounded, along with full refunds of towing fees that had been collected through fraudulent violations and manufactured infractions. I calculated the total financial impact on the criminal enterprise exceeded $25,000 when legal costs and penalties were included, ensuring that neither Dolores nor Eddie would profit from their crimes and providing meaningful compensation to the residents they had victimized. I witnessed the transformation of Pine Valley Estates begin immediately after Dolores's conviction, with residents working together to establish new community leadership based on cooperation rather than intimidation and mutual respect rather than fear. I watched Marjorie get elected as the new HOA president by unanimous vote, bringing her teaching experience and commitment to fairness to a position that had been corrupted by greed and abuse of authority for far too long. I saw the new board immediately revise community regulations to eliminate the arbitrary enforcement tactics that Dolores had used to generate revenue, replacing them with reasonable standards designed to maintain property values while respecting residents' rights and dignity. I observed property values in Pine Valley begin recovering almost immediately as word spread that the community had eliminated its reputation for HOA harassment and corruption. I watched Marcus choose to remain in Pine Valley Estates permanently, finding that his role in bringing justice to the community had created lasting friendships and a sense of belonging that made the neighborhood feel like home in ways he had never experienced before. I attended 6 months after Dolores's sentencing, when the community held a celebration barbecue in the courtyard where her towing operations had once terrorized residents, with families gathering to share food and stories, while children played freely without fear of arbitrary punishment for minor infractions. I witnessed the perfect karma moment when Dolores's belongings were being moved out of her foreclosed house by a legitimate moving company whose truck parked exactly 4 inches over the painted line, receiving a polite reminder rather than a punitive towing order from Marjorie's common-sense approach to community management. I saw Marcus drive by during his regular patrol, notice the situation, smile, and continue on his way. I watched Marcus stand beside his perfectly parked truck, looking out over a community that had learned to trust again after months of systematic abuse. And I saw him reflect on how a simple 4-inch parking violation had exposed a criminal enterprise and brought justice to people who deserve protection rather than exploitation. I observed the children riding bikes through the courtyard, the neighbors chatting over garden fences, and the general atmosphere of peace and cooperation that represented everything community living should provide: safety, friendship, and mutual respect among people who had chosen to build their lives in the same place. I realized Dolores Tatum had learned the hard way that real power comes from serving others rather than exploiting them, and Pine Valley Estates had become proof that communities can heal and thrive when good people find the courage to stand up against corruption and abuse of authority, no matter how powerful the abuser might seem or how long their reign of terror has lasted. Sometimes justice comes slowly, and sometimes it comes disguised as a 4-inch parking violation that exposes an entire criminal enterprise built on manufactured rules and systematic exploitation. Eyewitness Marcus Thompson proved that one person with courage and authority can change everything for a community that had lost hope, while Dolores Tatum learned that karma doesn't forget addresses and eventually finds everyone who chooses to hurt others for personal gain. I watched the residents of Pine Valley Estates discover that they were stronger together than they had ever been apart. And their story serves as a reminder that bullies and criminals can only succeed when good people stay silent and isolated from each other, but that collective action and proper evidence can bring down even the most entrenched systems of abuse and corruption.